oftentimes we have a little bit of time. Take that time and actually to set forth a platform that will be stable enough to protect you in the event something goes sideways. Because the one thing I do know in studying and teaching use of force, we don't control the end result. We really don't. We're taught we do, right? You know, if you get them this way, do this way. I mean, I worked this job for 30 years. Let's talk about wrist locks, twist locks. I've never got a suspect to stand on the box. You know, hey, if you just stand here and give me your elbow, it just doesn't work that way, right? So the end result, and 99% of the people we deal with are under the influence of drugs, alcohol, or mentally ill, or all the above. They're not healthy people. You go back to the Eric Garner situation. They have heart disease. They've got a litany of medical conditions. They're not in fighting shape. So it's not a matter of fighting with them. It's how can we capture them most efficiently? And that's when I ended up coming up with my own program. Huntington Beach, the chief there, he loved it, and then it spread to Anaheim, and then it just started to go everywhere, and it was pretty successful. And I was ready to even walk away from teaching that because of the pandemic. I'm in process of just putting it all in a book, publish it. Whoever wants to read it can read it.
Welcome to the Transition Drill Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Pantiani. I appreciate you taking the time to watch, so let's get into this. Speaking about medical and taking care of yourself, you had a surgery recently. Are you doing good?
It's interesting. That was the weirdest thing, completely unrelated to anything. Well, they think it might have been from the NG tubes, but I started having a nosebleed in the middle of the night. It ends up being a hemorrhage, and then I started bleeding every 3 hours, and I was losing 4 to 8 ounces of blood. This wasn't a normal nosebleed every 3 hours. Yeah, no. And so finally, long story short, after 7 days in the hospital, 5 different surgeries because they were trying to figure it out, a blood transfusion because I'd lost so much blood. They'd finally figured it out.
Yeah, you were a couple quarts low.
Yeah. So, but no, they finally got it figured out and I'm good. But again, I lost the whole month of June. You talk about, I had all these plans, everything to do stuff. That's what I was talking about, the medical stuff. As you get older, stuff just goes sideways and you have to be prepared for it. I can't tell you how many cops that I've been in, they've contracted cancer or, some other weirdness, heart disease, something that's taken them out of the game for a period of time. That's not time that you get back. That's why I said in the beginning, you can replace money. You can't replace time, so live within your means, plan for the future, do the job of law enforcement. Don't be law enforcement. And then enjoy it. If you can get 15 years, we put 30 years in, think about it. If you can get 15 years back, you're ahead of the game. And a lot of people cannot.
No. And it, at a minimum, as altruistic as this sounds, if that's the right word, you want to look to get back as much as you put in.
Correct.
Your return on investment should be the same number of years you gave, should be the same number of years you get in retirement at your minimum. But yes, even 15 years for a lot of cops is winning the game.
Right. Right. Well, with our, with the 3 at 50, I imagine you probably had the same thing. I was fortunate enough to have the 3 at 50. I retired at 55. So again, if you look at my family history, we generally don't live to be 80, or 85 years old. But there are plenty of people out there who did, they could retire at 50 and they can live to be 80 with their genes. You want to be able to do that. But, I agree with you. It's getting as much as you can. Now, I remember back in LAPD, the old retirement system with LAPD was the 20 and out. And I think that was the proper way to do it because, LAPD's retirement was set up at the time where you can actually retire in your 40s and then go off and find another career.
Very much like the military.
Very much. But they also didn't retire at 90% either. The retirement rate, I think it was like 50% or 60%. It wasn't enough to live on. You had to go out and get another job. But they used to read off the names of these people who would go EOW and they would die at, 80, 85 years old. They put in 20 years, but they got 40 years of retirement in return. And that's the way to do it. Even if it's at 50%,
right.
You're still making that money, right? So I think it's key is recognizing that. And don't get caught up. Law enforcement, as you know, it's easy to get caught up in the hype, you know, and you have to look at your family and what's important to you, and being able to walk away and say, well, no, I'm going to do this because this is important for me. Because at the end of the day, when you retire, there's very few people that I talk to that I work with. You know, I tell the story that the day after my retirement party, so to speak, I went through my phone and I deleted 400 contacts out of my phone. I mean, these are contacts. I mean, they're all cops, good people, acquaintances. They're not friends, you know, and I just deleted them. I'm not going to talk to them anymore. Why do I need them taking up space? Not to sound horrible, but that's not my life now. My life now is over here. You know, it's something. And even though this is now related to law enforcement, like I said, I walked into this job prepared to tell them no. I was done with it. But I kind of felt a duty. I had developed so much expertise through law enforcement. It was selfish of me not to be able to share it on such a platform to reach so many different people, you know. And I was able to do it on my time. You know, hey, John, we have a meeting. I can't make that meeting. I'm golfing today. You know what I mean? So it's really not a job.
The application process, number one, golf when I want to go golfing.
Yeah, and I don't golf well, so it's not like it's a real high priority. But it's about spending time. And again, the people I go golfing with, they're not ex-cops. These are relationships that I developed outside of law enforcement. And it's interesting because I think it makes for better conversation sometimes.
Agreed, 100%.
You know what I mean? You know,
but to a disservice to the job, we aren't encouraged to develop those outside friendships as part of the normal onboarding, growing process in law enforcement.
No, you're correct. I think you have to be your own person. I think that the camaraderie can be, and I was very tight with a lot of partners that I worked with, but that doesn't mean that I had to hang out with them. You know, I've got some partners that, close people. I talk to them once or twice a year. You know, we touch base. You know, if I needed something, they would be there in a heartbeat.
Right.
But we ain't hanging out on the weekends. You know, it's just not something we're doing. I'm hanging out with friends who are outside of law enforcement. You know, these are relationships that you met people at the gym, or you met people, you know, from maybe they were from cops, but they're not cops, you know, and you just happen to click. Or maybe you were on vacation, you know. I mean, I can carry on a conversation with a dead fish, as my wife would say. But
my wife says I could talk to the wall, so it's the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, we would sit at a bar and, oh, hey, you doing? I'll buy you a drink or this, that, and the other. And you strike up a conversation, and next thing you know, there's a relationship that, you know, that spawns from that. And then, you know, hey, let's go to dinner, you know, and it just kind of grows from there. But I think it's important. You really have to diversify your interests in what you do. And I don't think that everything should surround your profession, especially if it's in law enforcement. It's intense enough as it is. You know what I mean? You have to be able to look outside of that window, you know, I think.
So before we move forward, we're going to take it backwards a little bit. Tell me about where you grew up.
So I was born in LA County, and I mentioned that, in San Pedro. Because I spent a lot of my childhood there in the LA Harbor. When I was about 5, 6 years old, my parents moved to Huntington Beach, and that's where I grew up, except for on the weekends when I was visiting my godbrothers and my grandmother and all that other stuff. So
was there something that drew your family to stay close to the ocean?
Well, it's interesting. In San Pedro, my parents couldn't afford to buy. You know, Huntington Beach at the time was kind of like the Riverside, Corona area, you know, was 10 years ago. You know, people in Huntington Beach 10 years ago couldn't buy in Huntington Beach, so they started moving out to the Inland Empire, right? It was kind of the same thing. As the population grew, that's where he could go. And I think my parents bought their first house in Huntington Beach for, I think it was $34,000. And then they were able to upgrade, you know, 6 years after that to a $72,000, which that house now is worth, my mom's still in it, it's worth $1.8 million. You know, it's ridiculous, you know. So, but I grew up in Huntington Beach, and that was pretty much it.
Big family, small family?
I have an interesting family. So my mom and dad, their parents, they grew up around the corner from each other. So all my aunts and uncles basically grew up as friends. My grandparents also were friends. So, for example, my grandfathers went to Green Hills Cemetery and picked out their plots together. So big family, aunts, uncles, they all knew each other. So it was really odd. So you can go to my father's parents' house, and it wouldn't be uncommon that my mom's brothers and sisters were there, and vice versa. So, and I didn't know anything different than that. That was like normal to me. You had this big, huge family, and then I had two brothers, and that was it. So very close family ties when it comes to that stuff.
Were you sports driven as a kid?
I was, yes. So always involved in sports ever since I can remember 4 or 5 years old. Different than sports today. You know how it is. Football season, you were playing football in the street. Basketball season, you were usually in somebody's driveway shooting hoop. Baseball season, you were either out in the field playing baseball or playing over the line in the middle of the street. Nobody was so focused on one particular sport.
Right.
So, and you all did that as kids, right? Whenever football season is, that's the rec sport that everybody went in and then did the other.
Well, you just hit on a key term, the rec sport, because I tell people this all the time, 40 years removed from being a kid and playing sports, I don't ever remember hearing the word travel ball of anything. You played at the local, whatever it was. That was the school where baseball was at. That's where you played baseball. You played, in the gym at one of the schools. That's where basketball was. Right. And you rode your bike there.
Right. Exactly. That's exactly it. I think we do our kids a disservice today. My daughter she was into softball. She was into softball, basketball, and volleyball. When she got to high school, she was literally told by the high school softball coach, you can't do these other things anymore. You got to focus solely on softball. And I thought, God, how stupid is that? I mean, because they each teach you something different. I mean, and what it does is all of a sudden now those recreational sports, which we did for fun, right?
Yeah.
Now it becomes a job. There's all this pressure put on these 12 and these 13-year-old kids because it's got to be for a purpose. You got to get a scholarship. You got to do this. No 12, 13, 14, or 15-year-old should be worrying about that. They should just go out there and play ball because they're playing ball with their friends, and that's not today's society.
I often tell this story when I'm talking to people. One of my kids was playing softball, and I remember sitting in the stands one day, and I didn't do the coaching because with 3 kids, they all did their own sports. I was like, I can't coach all 3, so I'm not going to coach any. But I remember sitting at a softball game one day, and the poor little girl on the mound was crying. And I'm saying to myself, why is she crying? And this wasn't older. This is 7, 8 years old. Mm-hmm. Why is she crying? She should be having the time of her life out there. And then I looked behind me, and her dad was basically sitting in line right behind the plate, basically mad dogging her. Mm-hmm. It's like, she's 8 years old. Mm-hmm. If your first words out of your mouth are, go have fun, you're doing your kids a disservice.
Yeah, I told my brother, so my younger brother, he's 8 years younger than I, my youngest brother, his daughter came up, followed my daughter's footsteps, and got into softball. So he started coaching in softball too. I did coach softball. And the first thing, so it was his first team. And I loved it because I didn't have a kid on the team. It was my niece, but it still wasn't my kid. And I said, Marcus, are you ready for this? And he said, yeah. I said, I'm going to give you one piece of advice just to kind of going forward. And he said, what's that? I said, the parents wreck it. Just know this, the parents wreck it. The girls don't wreck it. The parents,
they could care less.
They just want to go out there and have a good time. They really do. And I've been in some situations where I pulled parents aside saying, you're wrecking it, for your daughter. She's one particular thing. It was we weren't supposed to win. We ended up winning this championship. We shouldn't have won. The girls played over and beyond. But this one girl, she was a pitcher. And the parents were mad because she wasn't pitching enough. She was having a blast. And the mom was on her. And finally, I pulled the mom aside, said, you're wrecking it. Your daughter's having a great time. She's a kid. It's 10.
Right.
Let her play. Just let her play. The girls know. Just like we know when you're playing sports. I was a big football guy. You got 50 plus people on the roster. You know where you rank as far as your popularity, your charisma, your athletic ability, and everything else. It reminds
you don't need to ask the coach, hey, when am I going to play? Because you know if you're going to play or not.
And your parents don't know better than you. When you should be playing, in your mind you're going, No, so-and-so's better than I.
Yeah.
It reminds me of that line in the Remember the Titans movie where finally the kid takes him out and says, he's better than I am.
Yeah.
You know, they know. The parents don't know. Parents be parents and just be supportive that your kids are out there having fun. And that's the key.
I read an article when my kids were just starting to play sports, and they were interviewing very high-level athletes who had either gone on to successful college careers or even into professional careers. And the thing that stood out was the reoccurring theme that they all said was, when I was a little kid playing sports, when I got done with the game, don't talk to me the whole way home about all the things I did wrong. Ask me what my favorite ice cream flavor is. You know, be that parent that when the game's done, hey, you know what you did wrong. Let your coach tell you what you need to fix. Mm-hmm. But no, they want to, and like you said, they make their kids live that one sport 24/7.
It's no longer a game. It becomes a job. My daughter finally got burned out her senior year in high school. She comes to me, she says, I can't do this anymore. I don't want to do it. It's not fun for me anymore. And I told her, I said, then it's time to stop. You know, we don't need softball for a scholarship. That's not what it is. I mean, you'll go to school. We got money saved for you to go to school. That's not what it is. Just like law enforcement, when it stops being fun, you know, because we all join law enforcement and we're having a great time. And I used to, like you talked about earlier, those old disgruntled guys. I said, I never wanted to be that guy. Never want to be that guy. I always want to be the guy who's happy. I'm happy to be at work. I'm looking forward to going to work. And I look forward to the weekends and being home, but I enjoy it. And when it stops being fun, it's time to hang it up. It's time to stop. It really is. And like I mentioned earlier, you know, I spent 4 years with LAPD, which wasn't PERS, and then I ended up with 27 years. I left three years of PERS time on the table, which I could have worked for 9% more, but it's, you know what? I'll live 9% less.
Yeah.
I'll live more than 9% within my means.
But then you start going into that equation of 3 more years. Now I'm getting closer to 60. And then it becomes that point of diminishing return, because no matter how well you take care of yourself, the second half of your life is definitely perceived shorter than the first half.
Exactly. And it tends to go a little bit quicker, right? You know, I mean, I don't know how I became, I'm 58 years old now. It's like, I don't know how I got here so quick, you know? I had a old buddy, this is several years ago, we were at work, and he was a colleague, he was a fellow lieutenant, and finally he looked at me and he says to me, because we had done something and the young guys were looking at us, and he says, you know, I just noticed something, John. I said, what's that? He says, we're the old guys now. And I'm like, when did that happen? You know, because I still feel like the young guy, which I think that's why a lot of people wreck it, you know? You try to get involved in a younger man's sport, and it's like... But you're absolutely correct. We become the old. And as you get over that 50 mark, let's just say that 50 mark, and whatever, time speeds up, you know. And again, I'll say it again, you know, you can replace money. You cannot replace time. You ran out of time to trade for the money. And even if you did, you know, are you going to be able to spend it? I worked with a guy in South Central Los Angeles, 77th Division. And they have a drop program in LA. So you can retire and then you can spend 5 years as a retirement, and then basically all your money goes into a deferred compensation. You make a boatload of money. These people are always chasing this drop program. So Mike Shea was his name. He ended up, he's in the drop program. He's going to make a ton of money and then leave. And by the time he was done, he would have been 60 years old. He applies for the drop program. I think he's not 6 months into the drop program, and he gets diagnosed with mesothelioma. He didn't make it a year. Not even a year. But imagine if he would have left 5 years earlier, you know? He didn't get to spend any of that money.
Right.
You know? So, yeah, we're all human is what it is. And I can't sit there and tell everybody, absolutely do this. But, you know, you have to prioritize what's important to you. And there is life out there. I'm telling you, I love my life. I do. People say, aren't you bored, John? What do you do? And I said, anything I want.
Exactly what we all want during our entire career of, I want to just do whatever I want to do.
That's it.
Hell, I can do it now.
It's it. You know, I get my wife off to work. She still works, so I get her off in the morning. I enjoy my cup of coffee. I spend a cup. You know, you go to the gym or you go to get your workouts. There's no hurry. There's no rush. I don't have to rush through something because I've got someplace else I got to be as into work. I take my time. You know, I go to the grocery store. I do my shopping. I walk the dog. You know, at the beach. You know, I take a nap. I mean, all that stuff sounds stupid, but it's all stuff. Before you know it, it's wine time. It's 6 o'clock at night, you know, and I'm enjoying a glass of wine with my wife. You know, we're cooking dinner, and then the next day you repeat it. You know, and then occasionally, you know, a performer will call me and say, "Hey, can you be here to do this presentation?" Yeah, I'm available that day. So that kind of changes it out. And then you go on vacation and you do all that stuff somewhere else. That's basically what you do, right? I mean, I go to Maui twice a year. You know, I spend 20 days a year in Maui. 6 years ago, speaking of people, we met a couple, again, sitting at a bar. They were locals, and they become some of our closest friends. I mean, and so every time we go back there, a lot of times we go back there to spend time with them and their family. We're immersed in the culture. It's incredible. The Hawaiian culture is completely different than well, all cultures are different, but it's just so selfless and so loving and so open. It's just to be a part of that 20 days a year. It's incredible, and I would have never got to experience that had I not, been talkative and all that other stuff that does. I mean, I'm blessed to have them. They're great. They're great friends to this day. I had a complete blockage while we were in Maui one year in my stomach because of the shooting, and of course, where are you going to stay? My wife stayed at their house while I was in the hospital for 14 days. You know, you can't. Those friendships. You know, they're hard to come by. A lot of people don't realize that, you know, and even in law enforcement, a lot of people you think that are close friends. Again, I'm not putting anything by them, and they're not good people, but very few people I talk to that I worked with for 20 plus years.
If you want to see how strong a friendship is, leave your agency, for whatever reason, retire, quit, and see how many people you stay in contact with.
Yep. And have some adversity. Yeah. You know, adversity is the telltale sign of character. It really is. And that's true even on the job. You know, I've experienced that. You know, even when I was working, people that I thought were my friends, and all of a sudden there was some adversity, and it's like, oh, all of a sudden they weren't as loyal to, and again, people can have their own decisions, but don't say you're at one point and then do something else.
Right.
You know what I mean? And you know as well as I do, being in there, sometimes law enforcement can be pretty cutthroat, especially once you start moving up the ranks. Mm-hmm. You know, and to me, it wasn't even that important to moving up the ranks. I didn't want to be a lieutenant. I was asked to take the test by my chief because they were going to require a degree requirement for it, and I didn't have my degree. And he says, and I told him, I said, I'm fine being the training sergeant. I love this. And when I'm done with the training, I'll go back to patrol. I loved being a sergeant. I loved it. And he says, well, you know, I'm only going to be able, you know, you're not going to be able to take the test unless you go back to school and this, that, and the other. And I'm like, you know, I had such respect for this chief. I said, I'll do it for you. And I ended up finishing number 2 on the lieutenant's list, and finally thought, oh, thank God, that's over, you know, when I go back to being a sergeant. And the chief had a rule of 5, so he ended up skipping the guy who was number 1 and promoting me. I'm like, son of a gun. But
I'm sure and for those who aren't aware of that creates no animosity at all.
Well, you know, it's interesting because the same guy that he skipped to get to me at lieutenant, he also skipped him when I promoted to sergeant. He was ahead of me when I promoted to sergeant. So I basically jumped him twice. And that particular, when he promoted me to sergeant, I was like, nah, I'm a better candidate for sergeant. When he promoted me to lieutenant, and I told this colleague that, you know, he was a better lieutenant candidate than I was. I felt like he was. And mind you, this particular person, we had known each other since we were 19 years old. He went to Edison High School. I went to Huntington Beach High School. His wife and I worked at the same gym when we were like 19. She worked the front desk and I ran the health club. And interestingly enough, we worked LAPD together. So we knew each other all the way through. So we'd known each other for 30 years. So we were friends. There was animosity, but the animosity wasn't towards me. It was more at the chief. But, I even pulled him aside and said, Brian, Sergeant, I think I was a better candidate for sergeant than you were. Much more influential and a bunch of other things. But as a lieutenant, he was a much better lieutenant candidate than I was. If I was chief, I would have promoted him over me. Just being honest. You know what I mean? Anyways, so that's...
Let's go back to you being in high school. Mm-hmm. What were you thinking was going to be your adult life?
I didn't really know. I didn't plan it out like so many other people did. I was having fun. I loved high school. I was kind of the popular kid growing up, was heavily involved in football and weight training or whatever. And I just kind of figured I'd play football and then, graduate and then go to college and play football. It wasn't like today, though. It's not like I can't look at high school and say, someday I want to be a professional football player. It was just kind of,
the next step.
The next step is X. Unfortunately, and I had all that lined up. I had, in my senior year, I had quite a few offers, including an officer from University of Washington for scholarship offers or whatever. And halfway through my senior season, I suffered a pretty significant neck injury where I was somewhat paralyzed on the left side of my body. All the letters stopped. And it was a nerve injury, so it was going to take some time to heal. And so I couldn't even play football the following year. And the coaches came to us and said, John, we know you can't play football right now. Would you be interested in coaching? We'd like you to make you the defensive coordinator for our sophomore team. And I'm like, well, I still love football, and I was into weight training and coaching and everything else. So that was it. Long story short, I ended up spending 3 years coaching for high school, and then I was working at the gym. I was doing gym stuff. I thought, I'm going to be a coach and this, that, and the other. And then I was a personal trainer.
Were you doing college at the same time?
Mm-hmm. But what ended up happening is I started to look forward, and especially working at the gym. You have the opportunity being a personal trainer to make a lot of money, but I did not market myself well at all. So basically, I had clients that would pay me anywhere between $75 and $100 a workout, for me to give them dietary advice and workout advice, et cetera, et cetera. But then I could be in there working out by myself, and some Joe Schmo could ask, hey, can I ask you a question? I'd spend an hour and a half getting him the same advice for free. I thought, this is not a good career trajectory. I need to find something different. So I got my real estate license, and that's what I was going to do. And in the meantime, I got contacted by a member of the gym that I worked with, and it was a pretty higher end gym. And he's like, hey, I just bought this gym and I need some help. Can you give me some advice? And I said, yeah, I can help you out with this, that, and the other. And then he says, hey, I want to hire you to be the vice president of operations. I said, no, I'm out of the gym business. And he said, just help me get forward. And anyways, long story short, I ended up helping him. I ended up building this gym for him, bought all the equipment, trained all the personnel, this, that, and the other. But again, I didn't want to be in there. Well, while I was there, one of the clients there was a LA County Sheriff's deputy, and he used to talk to me all the time. And, I always was interested in law enforcement, but I never felt like I was mature enough for law enforcement. And now I felt like, God, this is something I really want to do. And that was the beginning of it. So then I started applying for law enforcement agencies, beginning with LA County and all the big ones, LA County, LAPD, Long Beach. I think I put in interestingly enough, I didn't put in an application to Huntington Beach. Huntington Beach at the time, though, they were lateral agencies. So they really weren't taking anybody. So LA County didn't accept me. LAPD did, and I went forward there and never looked back. So, and I've enjoyed it ever since.
What year was that? Did you start?
I got hired in 89. So I started the academy in 89.
Did you have anybody in your family or anybody else prior to meeting that one client that was kind of a motivator or a mentor for law enforcement?
No. Like I said, I've known, and there's a lot of law enforcement that come in and out of the gym. So I've known several people that did, but it was always kind of in the back of my mind type thing. But, talking to, he says, guys, you talk well with people, this, that, and the other, you got a good demeanor, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, gosh, I could do this. And this is a good, it's a good career to raise a family on, because the gym business wasn't. That was my thing. It's like I can't see myself raising a family, working at a gym. It just wasn't stable enough. But no, prior to that was it. I'm the first one in my family that I know of that's gotten into law enforcement, in and out, I should say.
When you got hired by LAPD, were you already thinking a stepping stone to lateral somewhere else, or were you potentially thinking a career at LAPD?
Oh no, I was going to be an LAPD dog I had a great time at LAPD. Honestly, I had a blessed short career at LAPD, almost 4 years. I went through the academy. I left the academy, went to a Newton division. I was one of the first two. There was two of us. The one of probationers ever to be brought onto their CRASH team. And when I left, when I had to wheel out, because your first year it's an automatic wheel, the sergeants came up to me and said, "John, if you're not in a specialty within the first 6 months, come back, because we'll take you back." And I'm like, great. So I went to 77th Division. I was there for a few DPs, for a few months, or whatever. About 6 months goes by. And having a great time working, I'm working with my classmate, and it was great, but I wasn't, in a specialty, and so I went back to Newton and said, "Hey, I'd like to come back and work CRASH again," because I had such a connection with them. He says, "Give it a little bit of time." Next thing I know, within 2 weeks, all of a sudden I get picked up for this specialty unit, and it was a great time. So working Newton in 77th, I had a great time, great group of guys, great supervisors. I thought my path in law enforcement was going to be the typical work specialties, get your stripes, go to Metropolitan Division, work SWAT. I mean, it's the typical, you were going to go, and a lot of my partners did that. Well, what ends up happening is right before the riots, I go to DRE school. My partner and I, we go to DRE school, and I run into a friend of mine who I knew from the gym, who was a Huntington Beach cop. And so DRE school at the time was, there was like a week preschool, and then there was 3 weeks of the regular school. It was a pretty intensive school. And so I spent just about a month with him and his partner at the thing. And Walter was his name. He says, "Hey, have you ever considered coming down to Huntington Beach?" And I'm like, "No, I didn't."
Real quick side note for those listening who don't know police acronyms. DRE is drug recognition expert.
Correct. Yeah. So interesting. All this happens right about the Rodney King time. And the morale at LAPD and the pay especially was really diminished. I mean, the city, Chief Gates was one of the best chiefs he is the best chief I've ever worked for. It's a shame. You can ask a young guy who Daryl Gates is, and they can't even tell you who he is now. That's how old we've become, right?
Yes.
Because I've actually tested that theory. But anyways, there was a lot of things going sideways at LAPD at the time, and pay was an issue too. This Huntington Beach officer, he was LAPD paid for me to go to DRE school, but I had to take all my own time to go. I had to drive my own car. Huntington Beach, they were paying him per diem. They gave him a training car. Oh my gosh, it was crazy. I mean, even their paycheck stubs were bigger than mine, I mean, and so and with everything going on, and I had a young family and I was struggling. I'm like, maybe it's time to reevaluate, career choices.
Any reservations of looking at an agency where you grew up, so living and working amongst probably a lot of friends and stuff like that?
No, I didn't look at it that way. I actually looked at it, I knew the city, so that's a benefit, because anytime, you go to an agency and, the first thing you got to do, you got to learn the city. I mean, you got to know where to go. So that wasn't an issue. I knew the culture of the city, which I think helped me a lot. There's been some situations where you run across friends, who are drunk. And, honest to God, I can remember one incident where the guy was, real quick story, there was a white supremacist that was passed out on this woman's front porch. And anyways, I go down there, and it turns out it's a buddy that I used to know. He had shaved his head, young guy, picked up on a girl. She told him, she gave him the wrong address, but what was interesting is when I went to go wake him up, I couldn't wake him up because he was drunk. I mean, I recognized him. I'm like, "Oh, this is Buddy." I'm shaking him. He won't wake up. And finally I wake him up, and he takes a swing at me, and I'm like, and I slapped him across the face, and I buddy, relax. He looks at me. He says, John? I said, yeah. And I go, what are you doing here? He says, I met this girl. And I'm like, well, you're not at that place. Where can I take, the Andy Griffith thing, right? My favorite, get in the back of the car and I'll drive you to whoever you're staying with. It's one of those things. So, no, I didn't have any of those reservations. Yeah, it was easy. It was an easy transition. It was different. I missed LA. I missed the activity level, but I didn't. I learned so much more. So you become an expert working in South Central Los Angeles when it comes to gangs and drugs and, all the really busy stuff. But there's a lot to police work. There's a lot of stuff that I didn't know about that I learned from Huntington Beach because you had the time to do that particular stuff. So for me, it ended up being a good transition. But, I've always been a big LAPD fan. I don't regret leaving, but at the same time, you miss that activity, and until it becomes to the point like we're seeing today where everybody's being second guessed, right? That's different. But
so your path took you towards defensive tactics. That is kind of where your specialty lies. Where did that come from? Were you into martial arts, fighting, that type stuff before you came into law enforcement?
So I did have a little bit of a martial arts. I started picking up grappling. And when I got to Huntington Beach, especially, I started grappling with some buddies, ironically, from LAPD. There was
everything takes you back to the other one.
It was. There was an instructor. His name was Peter. He was actually a fighter for the Gracies. So he grew up in Brazil. He grew up into the Gracie system, and then he came to Huntington Beach. Great guy, humble, whatever, and he ended up settling up in Upland. And so I get this phone call from partners of mine from the unit that I used to work. Said, hey, we know this guy, this, that, and the other. He opened a studio. We're going to roll around. It's just going to be like 6 or 8 of us, so nobody's going crazy. Because, some of those times people can get hurt in those things, right? But we're all friends, so nobody was trying to hurt each other. And I started grappling. And the Rodney King thing always stuck in my mind. Because, as a young cop, you're looking at that going, oh, my gosh. This is kind of what we taught. These guys are in big trouble, right? So I started getting involved and started studying and becoming a student of force use. And I think that was the beginning of it. And Huntington Beach then switched over to LAPD CMAP group. So we trained everybody like LAPD was trained after the Christopher Commission and all that other stuff. And we started doing that. And then I started reading up on the side, and then over years started to develop my own program.
But did the interest in increasing your knowledge purely for you, or were you already at a position of rank at this point?
No, I wasn't in a position of rank, actually. I think that my expertise, and not from just being a trainer, but actually as far as, how should I say it, different ideas on how to increase our force in law enforcement. I think that's one of the things the chief like, because very early on, I used to read, obviously Graham versus Connor, but there's so many other cases that the courts are giving us the breadcrumbs, but you gotta read through it. And that's when I came up with that capture concept. It's like the courts are telling us to move towards this one direction. And I'll be honest with you, it was tough. It was a tough sell in Huntington Beach. Huntington Beach had a reputation for being, no nonsense when it came to use of force. I mean, it was culturally, it was a tough thing. So I started keeping statistics. I started keeping statistics every time we struck somebody or hit somebody or this, that, and the other. And, statistically, and to this day, it holds true. We were only effective about 30% of the time anytime we hit somebody. It just turns into a beating, which is... And now we're looking into the camera age and everything else. But whenever we got them down to the ground and in using the jiu-jitsu that I was practicing with, if we can control the hips, we can end the fight that much quicker. And in my opinion, save careers. Because at this particular point, too, I was brought on as an advisor for Michael Schwartz and the Kelly Thomas thing. And one of the things that really, to this day, I remember sitting across from Jay Cicinelli, and we were strategizing as far as what to do. And we were even talking about him taking the stand. I mean, that's how, as you know, if you're taking the stand, your case is not that strong. And I remember talking to this guy, and I'm looking across from him, and I'm thinking, all of a sudden my mind wanders. And I asked myself, when you go home to your wife and your kids, what do you talk about when you get home? I mean, think about that. This guy's looking at prison. You know, his wife says, well, how did the day go? And you're talking about possibly going to prison. And I made a commitment at that particular time that as being part of the ACT team in Huntington Beach is nobody that I train is ever going to be in a situation like this. And it's not because what he did, because ultimately he was acquitted and everything else, but it's the decision making up to that. It really is. I call them platforms. It's that risk management decision making that we really aren't taught in the academies. We're not taught to it this day. You know, more often than not, officers who get involved in use of force, it's an emotional response, right? It's all you just show. Jay Cicinelli, he responded to an officer who needs help call. He gets there and he sees the officers fighting with this guy. Boom. You know, he doesn't know what the crime is. He just jumps into the fray. You know, oftentimes we have a little bit of time. Take that time and actually to set forth a platform that will be stable enough to protect you in the event something goes sideways. Because the one thing I do know in studying and teaching use of force, we don't control the end result. We really don't. We're taught we do, right? You know, if you get them this way, do this way. I mean, I worked this job for 30 years. Let's talk about wrist locks, twist locks. I've never got a suspect to stand on the box. You know, hey, if you just stand here and give me your elbow, it just doesn't work that way, right? So the end result, and 99% of the people we deal with are under the influence of drugs, alcohol, or mentally ill, or all the above. They're not healthy people. You know, you go back to the Eric Garner situation. They have heart disease. They've got a litany of medical conditions. They're not in fighting shape. So it's not a matter of fighting with them, it's how can we capture them most efficiently. And that's when I ended up coming up with my own program. Huntington Beach, the chief there, he loved it, and then it spread to Anaheim, and then it just started to go everywhere. And it was pretty successful. And I was ready to even walk away from teaching that because of the pandemic. You know, I'm in process of just putting it all in a book, publish it. Whoever wants to read it can read it and be done with it. Because I'm really kind of done until I was approached with this job with Perform. And it's like, I can get a lot of the platform stuff. I can get a lot of the education stuff done through this platform. That's perfect. It's still helping cops.
And we're talking about your P.E.P.
Mm-hmm.
If you can briefly describe the acronym and what it entails.
So P.E.P is an acronym. It stands for Platforms, Efficiency, and Proficiency. And so under the platforms, it's what is your platform? What is your probable cause? What is your legal authority for even able to open it up? And is it strong enough? Is your platform strong enough to deal with the worst case scenario? And the worst case scenario is always serious bodily injury or death because you don't control the end result. So always take the time in order to reinforce and build that platform in case it goes sideways. A real quick example, in Huntington Beach, we used to have, and every agency does, municipal codes or county ordinances. You know, if you research them, a lot of county ordinances or municipal codes, they've just never been challenged in court. Many of them could be very much illegal on its face. I mean, I know Huntington Beach had to take a few off the books because when it got challenged, this is not constitutional, right? I mean,
we just made these up 50 years ago and never got rid of them.
That's exactly right. But some cops are breaking the law. Well, this law it's not a strong platform if you're going to open up that bag of 835 and use force on them. So that's on you. So I talk about that. So let's say you have the basic municipal code or, that goes out there, and that's your PC. Well, maybe take a little bit extra time, do a little bit more investigation, tie it into a penal code, which is a little stronger. Or maybe there's a warrant, which is even a stronger platform. Is the warrant for violence or nonviolence? Because there's a difference in that. Understand really what they're talking about in Graham versus Connor. Because yes, you can use crime, but the severity of the crime is a key factor in Graham versus Connor. Really understand that. You take a cop 10 years, 15 years on, they know about the Graham copper. Yeah, that's the reasonableness test. But they can't tell you that, well, it's reasonableness under the totality of circumstances, and that might be the severity of the crime. And then you get into the efficiency part. 9 out of 10 of the techniques and devices that we're being taught in the academy to this day all deals with pain compliance. Again, most of these people under the influence of alcohol, under the influence of drugs, mentally ill, or all the above, they're not feeling pain. So we've strapped a camera on everybody. we're teaching our people pain compliance, and all we do is go from one pain compliance technique to the other, and it's all captured, right? Well, using some of the jiu-jitsu thing, I know that if you can control the hips and the lower part of the body, you control 80% of a person's fighting efficiency, especially if there's two people involved. Right? The P.E.P is designed for two officers. If it's one officer and one suspect, obviously that use of force bar, people are going to look at it through a different lens.
Right.
Where we run into trouble is when you have multiple officers on scene, one suspect, the suspect goes 10-7, right? And that's what it is. Well, if you can I used a very simple figure 4 technique to wrap up the legs and secure the hips, and all of a sudden we could slow the whole incident down and capture the suspect. So that was the efficiency portion of it. And then the proficiency portion of it is actually the department's responsibility in order to keep the ongoing training, stay current with the current statutes, law, case law, etc., and keep statistics. Look at what's working and what's not working. And I think that's the key. I spent 5 years running statistics, and basically all our pain compliance stuff was only effective 30%. When you got to taser, taser was effective about 64%. Our carotid restraint, which we don't have now, which is fine because we can use other things, again, it was within the 60%. But those, and then our capture techniques that we taught, 83% effective rate. That's huge. I mean, just look at the statistics. Do I want to strike somebody? I have 30% efficiency, or do I want to wrap them up and use our capture techniques, wrapping up the hips? 83%, and you're looking at less injuries, But having to sell that to 30-year cops, 20-year cops who are basically used to, and again, we teach boxing in the academy today, I used to tell chiefs, if you don't want them to do it, stop teaching it, stop training them in it. If I had it to do, 80% we'd be tracked using capture techniques, and I think it shows better on video. There's less injury, and then you have to add the medical component, right? That's the other biggest challenge for law enforcement, recognizing when it's no longer an enforcement issue and it becomes now a medical emergency. And that's the key. And officers are not being trained in that. You can call it excited delirium, agitated delirium, call it whatever you want. And people can say, the bottom line is you have people dying in custody through a medical condition. Cops have to recognize when that becomes a medical issue. George Floyd, as we talked about earlier, was that cop trained in those I would venture to say no, because if he was, he would have recognized the signs. Medics would have been there. In Huntington Beach, we got to a point where we worked so closely with the fire department that when we got those calls where you could sit there and say this could have been an agitated event, the cops would get called to it, but also we'd call the fire department, and they were staged to give medical treatment as soon as it was done. They were ready, and then we were very successful in our chemical sedation program with Huntington Beach too, which helped, I think, a lot. So.
From its inception in your brain of the P.E.P program to implementation, what was the total time?
Oh,
ballpark.
Wow. Yeah. It's interesting. So there was a case, a Ninth Circuit case called Beaver versus Federal Way. And I remember reading that case, and basically it was a taser case in which the officers used the taser 5 times. And the court said, we're good with the first 3 times, but the last 2, you had enough cops there, you should have been able to deal with it, so it was unreasonable. And that case specifically was the one when I really started to push it. And we happened to be it happened to be an AOT, an advanced officer training year, where we have to do our perishable skills training every 2 years. I can't remember what year it was, but that was the key. So I would say it took me about 18 months. And we started implementing all that ground stuff, all the capture stuff, and everything that we did. So our qualifications every other month that we did for weaponless, it incorporated capture training. Our perishable skills every 2 years, it revolved around the capture training. Even our taser qualifications. Our taser qualifications would be, if it was you and I, and you were the taser operator, we would teach, you deploy the taser, and then you move to the back in order to clear the wires from the legs so your partner officer can go ahead and wrap up the legs and the hips. Everything. And what sold it ultimately is when you told the officers the statistics, when you talked about them. Because officers, They did. You know, we've been hitting each other since we were 2, right? I mean, when you go into stress, you go back to what you feel comfortable with. But when all of a sudden you started showing the officers, hey, when we hit people, we're only effective about 30% of the time. But when we do this, 83%, even some of the OGs were on it. And they didn't get hurt, you know? So it took about 18 months. And then I'll never forget it. Anaheim PD came to one of my lectures and heard it. And they approached me and they said, we want to go to this. We want to make it post-approved. We want to do this and the other. And I went, oh, I really don't want to deal with post. I'll be more than happy to train your instructors and train your department or whatever. And then it just spread. It went from Anaheim to Santa Ana, about half the Orange County agencies. I started teaching it through the Institute for the Prevention of In-Custody Deaths. And so I picked up some agencies in Colorado and everything else. But you know as well as I do, there's a lot of law enforcement out there. And it's hard to do with one particular person, you know. It's had great success. So again, I don't know how you get it out there other than publish it in a book and let people do what they're going to do. But I do think it's law enforcement for the future. We have to change how we're training officers. We have to go from teaching them how to fight to teaching them how to capture human beings who are resistant and recognizing medical emergencies when they occur. Because you're talking about saving lives. You know, that's the biggest change. In law enforcement, the biggest change in law enforcement in the last 30 years is the criminal prosecution of police officers. And some of that is just they weren't trained.
Right. When you finally got it to a point of implementation, it sounds like your agency immediately bought off on it and started implementing it. Did you have any desire to make it grow into a company that it I don't want to say it became, because it sounds like you kind of resisted making it something that could grow, but was that in the back of your mind?
So it's interesting because I had so many people that said, you know, because you know how it is when you're going through law enforcement, there's a lot of people that talk about, you know, leaving law enforcement and doing more. I didn't want to retire from law enforcement and do law enforcement stuff, be honest with you. You know, I came from the health and fitness and coaching world into law enforcement. So that was a chapter of my life. And I came into law enforcement. And when I left law enforcement, I wanted to go into another chapter of my life.
The golfing life.
Yeah, whatever it was going to be. But I didn't want it to be a law enforcement part 2. So I really struggled with that stuff because I had a bunch of people. So I always made myself available for questions and anything else. But finally, it got to a point where it's like the only way I could really walk away from it is if I started documenting it. And so I started collecting all my notes and putting it into a thing until Performa, you know. And like I said, when they approached me, it's like, oh, well, we can get a lot of the platform stuff done in the P.E.P. You can't get the efficiency stuff. The platform stuff I can get with this particular thing. And that's the key, you know, because making good decisions legally and everything else is that's 90% of it when it comes to officers making those good decisions. And so it's like, oh, it takes very little work for me to do it. I can go ahead and write the outlines. We can talk about Graham versus Connor. We could talk about these other cases, whatever. We could put it in that app, in that program, and we can train tens of thousands of officers a lot easier than if I was to book myself on lecture tours. You know what I mean? And that leaves more time for me to go do my thing. So, you know, it turned out to be good. I could still share the experience because, you know, law enforcement gave me 25 years of education and experience in use of force, which has been very helpful. I feel I at least owe to return the favor if I can save cops. If it saves one cop a career or their life, then it's well worth it. That's the way I always look at it. And you're only going to be credible for a short period of time, right? You know, I always looked at some of these guys who were use of force experts and they retired, and, you know, 15 years later, they're still teaching use of force. And you go to their lectures, it's like, we don't do that anymore, you know? So I kind of looked at myself, you know, like I retired 5 years, you know, last 55. So I look at, you have like a 5 to 7 year window. I don't expect to be doing any of this in the next 2 to 3 years, you know.
Just because you feel you'll time out as far as your relevancy, or because you just don't want to be doing it?
It's both. It really is. I think you're relevant. I think, you know, right now it's funny when we go to different places, a lot of people will know either of my program or my name, especially in Orange County or some of these other places. That's gonna run its course. You know, if and when I publish my book, then people might recognize that as well. Like I said, that's been put on the back burner because I've been working with this, but, and that's okay. But you have to, it's time to walk away from the game at some particular point. It's kind of like,
that's a hard thing to do for a lot of people, though.
It is. I like to use a lot of football analogies. You ever look at, some of the broadcasters, let's say, and they were big football players. They were linemen. I always look at the linemen, right? You see this guy who was an offensive lineman. He weighed 330 pounds. They show you when he was there. And now all of a sudden he's a broadcaster and he weighs 185 pounds. I mean, that person has totally
changed their life.
Changed their life. Exactly. They've moved on. They've moved past, that whole being involved in the game. I think law enforcement, it's very transitional. I think it's transitional even as we promote. I think you're a doer, as a worker bee. You promote to supervisor, then you supervise the doers. And then you become a manager and you manage the people who are supervising. I think where a lot of people fail in management, administration, or whatever, they're still trying to do things as a doer. If you took the test, you no longer get to play. Yeah, I mean that, right? You know what I mean?
You bring up a great point. There are a lot of bosses, and we've all worked for them. And the good ones know to take that one step back and let the doers do the do. You sit there and you say to yourself, man, I would really like to be able to do that, but my job is to take the step back and basically be the quarterback. Let me view the entire field. Hey, Bob, let's move you a little forward. John, we're going to pull you back a little bit.
Right. That's exactly it. Especially the first line, right? Supervisor, sergeant. You go from, you're working a squad with a bunch of guys, and then all of a sudden you promote to sergeant. Let's say you get into a scrap, and three of your guys are there, and they're fighting with the guy. You don't help them they've got this. They've got this. Where you could be of most help is if you supervise the scrap. Because if you're involved in it, you can no longer be objective, right? But if you say you've supervised it and you're watching, hey, grab that arm, slow down, you got this, you got that. That's how you help that person. I used to call being a sergeant and being the supervisor, you become the godfather. The guy's going to fight you, before you were, you were the enforcer and you did it. Now you go give the guy a kiss on the forehead and you let your guys do their thing. You know what I mean? It's just, I had this one lieutenant that, and he was a sergeant when I came to the agency. Well-known guy, well-respected, great guy. As a lieutenant, he would still be out there working, and I'll never forget it. He got done with some, I don't know if he ran after somebody or whatever, but he's sitting on an ice bag in the watch commander's office. And I'm just thinking, you do age out of some of this stuff.
You're not 21 anymore.
No, and then I had a fellow, it was funny, one of my bosses, he also became a lieutenant. And he would comment on this other lieutenant. And he says, we were on this big call-out scene. It was an auto theft barricade, this, that, and the other. And he's watching all this brass run back and forth. The captains are out there. They're doing their thing. You got lieutenants out there, whatever. And he's looking at him and he says, I'm going to get in my car and go home. We just look stupid when we try to do police work at our age. and I kind of got a lot of my supervisory stuff. I got it from guys like that because he recognized when he's going to be helpful and when he's not going to be helpful.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's, there's a reason people retire from professional sports and coach.
There's also the reason why a lot of them retire and don't.
There is that as well.
The overarching theme in this conversation that I really enjoyed is the importance of when your time is up, accept it and move on. Don't try to, are you out of the pool or you're not? You're not standing on the side of the pool with a foot still in it.
Correct.
So correct. The importance of recognizing that in yourself and accepting, hey, it's time for me to step back.
Yeah, you're now that 15-year athlete where it's like, my skills have I can't run hot anymore. I mean, honestly, when I promoted to sergeant, I loved working uniform patrol. And when I promoted, it really got to a point where, God, it's a lot tougher for me to put up the numbers, to run hot all the time, to make the arrests, to do that stuff. It's an effort. It was never an effort before. it's time for me to coach, you know, and that's why I did it. And then, like I said, the management part, I really had no issue with that. I didn't have any, I didn't want to do it, but it ended up working out in my favor, I think, in the long run. But yeah, it's the best job in the department's a sergeant. I tell people that all the time. So
let's talk about your transition, because you've made subtle references to it. Ultimately, your plan was to walk away and leave law enforcement, but you got drawn into something on the private side. Tell me about the company you're with now and how that came about.
Yeah, so it's a company called Performa. It falls under the C umbrella, CIE. Anyways, it's kind of interesting. So Performa started as a sports app. And if you ever look at it, there's a camera behind home plate of every baseball. It captures the pitcher throwing the ball, right? Well, Performa basically came up with a training app that captured that pitcher throwing the ball and gamified it, basically, using neurocognizant science. And basically what it does is when it plays like a game, you watch the pitcher throw the ball, and as quickly as you can, you identify what pitch it is. And as you level up, just like in any game, you get that hit of dopamine, you know, I get to go to the next level. You see less and less of the pitch. So pretty soon you're identifying this pitch with very little information. So they put together this app, and they had to test it. They took a well-known baseball team. They divided the team in half. They gave half the team the tech. The other half they just went on status quo. The team that got the tech, their batting averages went up 380%, which is huge. And
just from being able to identify a pitch better, or quicker,
right? Yeah, because they trained their brain in order to do this. So Performa, the people who ran it, said, you know, what if we did this in law enforcement using body-worn camera footage, right? Identifying trends and everything else, and implementing statutory law, case law, and everything else. And so they partnered up with Pasadena PD for their body-worn camera footage, and I'll shorten this up, and they came up with a product. Well, one of the guys knew a sergeant at Huntington Beach and said, hey, what do you think of this thing, when they were still in the talking stages of this stuff? And the sergeant at Huntington Beach says, oh, no, that sounds great, but you need a force expert. And he says, oh, well, do you know anybody? And this guy says, yeah, I know just the guy. And then next thing you know, I was going to dinner, and you know, my friend, he told me, he says, this is what it's about. And I'm like, I'm really not interested in this. I don't want to go back to work. I don't want to do anything with law enforcement, this, that, and the other. But when I saw the product, I was sold on the concept. It was like, oh, I can't let this opportunity go by. And it would require very little of my time, because it's just my expertise. You know what I mean? It was an advisory position. And then I got hooked into it. And it's that was 4 years ago. And now we're starting to take off. I think we've got over 100 agencies that are involved, that have signed up for the program. We've got 3 different states that are signing on to it. The Attorney General and the Governor of California has bought into it. Post is Performa is the only 1053 self-guided course ever in Post right now. So it's been successful. And, you know, the way this thing works is that, you know, I'll be able to walk away from it in a year or two when it gets to where it's done, and then I'm done. And then I'm completely done with law enforcement. And then I could say, I've done my part to give back from the training perspective. And, you know, at that time, I'll be, 60? So, you know, if you start doing the math, you know, you still, you know, God willing, you stay out of the hospital or whatever, you still have 10 years to play and do whatever it is you want to do, which is the key. You know, I mean, there's law enforcement takes a heavy toll on your body and your mind, physically, mentally, or whatever. It affects people. The key is being able to survive all that and enjoy life after the fact. You're not jaded at society. That's the one thing I can say. I'm not jaded at society. I don't hate everybody. I think 99% of the people human beings are still good people. You know, it's that 1% that wreck it for everybody. So I don't paint everybody with the 1%. But I can tell you that after 30 years, my body has definitely taken, you know, a beating. So, you know, it seems like every 18 months I'm going through some sort of medical procedure and then rehabbing again or whatever. And, you know, and I think that's not uncommon. I think most cops go through that, you know, your back, your heart, your blood pressure, whatever it is, you know, so you owe it to yourself. I think that when you do get retired, get healthy.
Speaking of getting healthy, you made mention to having a blockage experience while you were in Maui related to your shooting.
Yeah. What
was the extent of your injuries related to the shooting?
So in 2012, I was shot. Nothing heroic. It was an accidental. I was the commander of the SWAT team. We had just shot that day, and we were actually just wrapping things up, and everybody's cleaning their guns, and one of my operators didn't clear his gun properly. We had an accidental discharge. The round entered my left leg, went north. I was kind of leaning back in my chair, and so the round entered my left leg, went north, went through my colon, my bowels, my large intestines, my small intestines, and lodged up against my left kidney. Pretty significant damage. So the interesting thing from a use of force standpoint is I didn't even know I got shot. I always go through the thing, you know, because people always talk about pain and whatever. I didn't recognize I got shot. I didn't know I was shot. I mean, we had a SWAT medics and an ER doc who was part of our SWAT team, and I didn't realize I got shot until they were on top of me, literally cutting my clothing off, putting a tourniquet on, and I'm trying to figure what's going on, and then I hear somebody behind me say, "It's ball ammo, it's ball," and then I was able to put two and two together and figure out what happened. So, you know, ignorance. I kind of figured out they'll take me to the hospital, they'll pull the bullet out of me, I'll be back to work in 2 weeks. I woke up with a bag, you know. As a cop, that's pretty devastating.
Yes.
You know what I mean? It's like they turned me. I became one of the bad guys. You know what I mean? Because the only people I knew bags, you know, were the gang members.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And it's funny because, I mean, I wake up from this, you know, 10-hour surgery and everybody's whispering, well, who's going to tell him? Who's going to tell him? Because, you know, I didn't know. And it's like finally somebody told me and I had to look down and I was so depressed. No, the good news was they were able to take down the bag. But every time you do that, they resection you. Now here's what happens. So you have a ton of small intestines, you know, 30 feet or something like that. They're able to cut out the stuff they couldn't fix, and then the stuff that they were able to fix, they put it together and they sew it. You create scar tissue. The scar tissue that grows on the top is okay.
It's
the scar tissue that grows in the middle, it's going to create an obstruction. So they had told me that this is kind of what you have to worry about. You're going to have to worry about hernias, which that occurred about a year afterwards, and then this obstruction. But honestly, again, naive, I'm thinking, I don't have to worry about this till I'm like in my 70s, right? No, it didn't take long at all. I was on vacation in Maui, and all of a sudden I started to get really, really sick, and ended up in Maui General with a complete obstruction. Had to go through emergency surgery to get resectioned again, you know, so it goes back to one of those things is you don't control everything that goes forward in your life. When you're in your 30s, you feel like you're invincible. You know, when you do 30 years in law enforcement, it beats up on your body in a number of different ways, you know. And so you can't sit there and
bullet beats up on your body in a completely different way.
It is interesting how much damage one bullet can do. You know, you'd think it's like, they pull the bullet out and then it's the gift that keeps giving, it seems like. Yeah. But you have to, at the same time, again, if you retire when you're 50 or you're 55, you look forward and you have to start doing the math. Look, hereditary, how long do I expect to live? And then let's say if you're going to live to 75, that's 20 years, 55 to 75, 20 years. And how many of those years are going to be quality years where I get to do the stuff that I want to do physically, that I'm able to do those particular things? I think that's important. I don't think a lot of people realize that, because you're going to have, just through aging, you're going to have deteriorated health. I mean, every surgery that I've ever been through, and I've been through a lot of them, the doctors always say, God, you're in great shape, so you were able to recover from surgery. But it still means that you had, you're a few months on the shelf, and over 20 years, if you were to go through all that stuff, that's going to take time away from stuff that you want to do.
Right.
So you have to look at it like that. It's not like you're going to retire and you're retiring like it is when you're talking about when you're 30 years old. The time to plan for that is when you're younger. Live within your means, invest where you can invest, and longer. You might have a retirement. If you're a PERS guy, you're going to have that guaranteed retirement, this, that, and the other. Put some money away in deferred comp so you get to determine when you retire rather than having the system dictate when you retire. Having those choices, I think, are huge. I had a when as a young cop, I had a guy who basically forced me to invest in deferred comp. He was an OG, and I couldn't afford it, but just to get this guy off my case, it's like $25 a month. I guess I'll just, it's dinner, It was one of the best decisions I ever made. And before I retired, every time I ran into young guys, I would say, hey, start maxing out your deferred comp. You get to choose when you leave. Because you can replace money, you can't replace time. That's just it. We take time for granted, I think, in law enforcement. I'm sure there's a lot of other agencies. My brother's a fire captain in Burbank, and we talk about this a lot, and they do the same. But fire guys, they get to sleep half their career, so I kind of don't give it that much credit. I'm just kidding.
Well, and to go back to my podcast for a little bit, using that story, you're sitting in a chair, something at training. Mm-hmm. I'll use the term fat, dumb, and happy. Everything's done. We're winding down for the day. It could have gone completely different to where that next day you were no longer in law enforcement. Now obviously you had your recovery time and everything else, but not even, and that's what's so important for me that I've found in doing this podcast is you don't have to put anything per se in place for tomorrow, but at least be thinking about what might you do should something like that incident occur.
So it's interesting because the person who suffered the most from this incident, in my opinion, is actually the person who shot me. So you got to remember that in his mind, his nightmare is exactly what you described, the end result. I mean, I did everything I could to get back to I came back to work 6 months after I got shot, which the doctors did not want to release me. But it was important for me to come back, especially with my position in the department, my rank. My leadership told me I need to get back. I need to be able to walk through that door so that officer can see me and say, he's normal. The sooner I can do that, the sooner he could be able to heal. And I can tell you, to this day, he's still not healed. I mean, I still get text messages, on Christmas and different things. And that's his nightmare. So to your point, sometimes you could be on that other end and it's something you still have to deal with for the rest of your life.
Right.
I mean, there's two things. There's 2 points to that, right? I mean, so you're absolutely correct in your observation of that particular thing, but you don't control it. The other thing I think it's important too is you got to recognize what you have control over. And I've said this before. In Huntington Beach at the time, we're part of what they call a JHAT group. So once every quarter, we trained with other agencies. Anyways, when I got shot, the Santa Ana SWAT sergeant, the Anaheim SWAT sergeant, they all came in and said, hey, how you doing, this, that, and the other, blah, blah, blah. And I started reflecting, what could have I done to prevent this? Because you have no control over other people. You only have control over your attitude, the way you look at things in your decision making. And there's some things I could have done different. I should have never let that guy train. In law enforcement, we constantly are pushing the envelope. We'll work 20 hours, 25 hours. But there's science that shows that through sleep deprivation, you're going to make errors, right? How often do we push our cops to work beyond 12, 15 hours? You know what I mean? We do it, and there's a certain pride. Oh, God, I worked 20 hours. We are more lucky than good in law enforcement. And when I started looking at this particular officer, he had gone on a 2-day fishing trip, had come back, crappy sleep, was not well rested before he went shot. I knew all that. He was going through a bunch of issues. He was the POA president, so he's going through a bunch of political issues. I understood. Knowing what I would have never let him train. And that incident, so I'm partially responsible for my own shooting. And I used to have these other SWAT commanders go, that's ridiculous. We all have to look at things through that prism in my mind. If we really want to correct some of the things that are going wrong. I'm not saying, I shot myself in the leg. I'm just saying, though, is there anything I could have done to prevent it? And the answer is always yes. There's always something, even though it's not evident. But me sharing it with those SWAT commanders, maybe they can save that incident that's going to happen to them. Because complacency in law enforcement is our biggest enemy. It really is, And I'll even say that it carries itself even beyond after we retire, because we do. Complacency leads to taking things for advantage. You know what I mean? Taking it for granted. We go out away with it for so long that it's going to be okay. And then all of a sudden we retire, and several years afterwards, we run into a medical issue. We get cancer. We get mesothelioma. Our back goes out, this, that, and the other. And all of a sudden, life isn't what we thought it was going to be. And then depression sets in. So the time to deal with this is early on in your career, and then plan you plan your life accordingly. You know, so there is life after law enforcement. It really is. You know, that would be my advice. And I've always said that to even young guys. You know, take advantage. You plan your retirement, so you leave when you want to relieve. You have a great opportunity to leave very early on and do nothing if you do it correctly. Do you need the boat? Do you need that Dodge Demon with the blacked out? And the reason I bring it up is I had a very young cop. He's no longer a cop. He ended up getting fired, actually. As soon as he got off probation, he went out and bought this $100,000 car. The windows were all blacked out and whatever, and he showed it, and I'm thinking, what a waste. What a waste. You know, he's 20-something years old. You know, he's not married or whatever. You know, you can make decisions that can be beneficial to you 25 years later, you know, rather than run out and do that. And especially for him, like I said, he didn't survive, got in some issues, and he ended up getting terminated. But yeah, what a waste.
Back to the company that you work for today, Performa. Mm-hmm. For those that aren't aware of the company, what's the website? Where can they find it?
So nobody in the private sector can find it. Okay. It's only available, actually. Yeah, it's very secured because we actually use body-worn camera footage. So everything's encrypted and secured. If you were to go ahead and Google it right now, nothing would come up. So the only people who have access to even the information are law enforcement agencies, current law enforcement agencies. So if there's people listening and they're currently involved in law enforcement, if they go to, and they're in California and they go to the Post website or whatever, you'll see Performa, and then you'll get a link. We do demonstrations every Thursday at 2:30, in which we demonstrate the product, and then if people are interested, they can onboard after that.
Silly question, because it's a virtual platform, are your demonstrations virtual?
We do them via Zoom.
Okay.
So it's basically we'll show one scenario. It's a 2-minute scenario, 2 minutes out of a 4-hour segment. Right. And then, but again, it's question and answer as far as, but yeah, nobody can just go on the line and look at it. It's secured. And we are currently onboarding other video. Again, we're getting video from everything. So the way it works is because each agency actually owns its own video content. It's not actually owned. And then what they do is they enter an agreement with Performa, and then they're not even subject to PRA, because we basically wall it off. We ended up being the owners of it. We could be subpoenaed for it, obviously, right. but we don't have to adhere to a public records request because we're not a public entity.
If anybody's got questions, maybe more along your P.E.P platform, do you anticipate a book coming out?
Yeah, I'm in the process. So it's interesting because this P.E.P thing's been a long time coming. I got a lot of notes. I just got to compile it. It's probably going to take at least 18 months, I would say, before I can get all this stuff. Hopefully the Performa stuff slows down. But anybody who is interested in it, you can email me at pepforceuse@gmail.com. So, and there's stuff if they're on LinkedIn, I think that's where you found me. I think I have some of my articles that have been posted on that. And it explains the P.E.P concept is very simple, which is why I like it. I think in law enforcement, sometimes we tend to be a little bit, how should I say? We tend to make things a little more complicated than needs to be. When I started doing this, I love your P.E.P thing. Can you make it an hour? It's not really an 8-hour course. It really isn't. The concept is this, and even the technique is so simple. It doesn't require that much. And I think in law enforcement, that's what you need. When LAPD went to the CMAP group, and they had like 8 to 10 different ground training things. I remember looking at this stuff going, it's going to be too complicated for cops. Cops don't have time to go out there and practice. This is one very simple leg cross figure 4 technique. Even my heaviest, out of shape 30-year cop was able to do that, and sit on their legs and control their hips and not get hurt, So it's a very simple technique.
People sometimes don't like simple. Sometimes they think that as we move forward, it should become more complicated. And almost it seems, as we move forward, going backwards is actually sometimes better. Because like you said, I can teach this to the 1-year cop and I can teach this to the 30-year cop.
The people who don't like it simple are usually the people who came up with it because they want to make money out of it. So it's like, you can only learn this through me.
Right.
That wasn't my intent. My intent was to save officers from going to prison. So I'm not that this is going to sound stupid. I mean, I decided to become a cop. What your earning potential is, this, that, and the other. My life isn't built around me flying in Learjets.
Filthy rich is what's going to happen.
It's not, and it never has been, and that is what it is. I make a very good retirement as a lieutenant from Huntington Beach in the PER system. I live well within my means. I mean, I'm fine. So, like, even with the P.E.P stuff, I can't tell you how many times I get phone calls. I tell people, I'll come teach. Because I'm retired. I get to do what I want.
Right.
You want me to, I had a buddy of mine, he's still working. He's a little bit older than me, works at, in a small agency in LA County. And he's like, we got all these problems. And I told him about Performa because it's a good way. But a lot of their problems are report writing. I told him, I said, hey, Dave, I said, you want me to come and teach a 2-3 hour class on how to write a use of force report? I'll be more than happy to come out and do that. It costs me nothing.
Right.
I'm getting paid by PERS. My check comes every month. You know what I mean? If I got time, I'm not golfing and I'm not, maybe I have to miss a nap, but if I can benefit, if I could save an officer to do that on my time, yeah, what the heck, because it's limited. Because 2 or 3 years from now, I don't expect to be involved anywhere. I don't think you have the credibility anymore and you're done with it. 60 years old, it's time for me to move on. And do something different and chalk this up. I was a trainer. I ran health clubs. I was a football coach. I was a policeman. Yeah, now I do whatever, so move on. It's another chapter in your life. You close one chapter, another chapter opens. So, and I think that's healthy, to be honest with you as well. I think mentally it's healthy, and you meet new people. You're not surrounding yourself, 30 years. I think we talked briefly about it. I don't have a lot of close friends that are officers. I mean, not that I don't appreciate the people that I've worked with over 30 years. Don't get me wrong. I love them all, but am I hanging out with cops on the weekend? No, not generally. Even the few officers that I work with at Performa, I don't see them on a social basis, basically. I mean, we might talk a couple times, but my close friends that I hang around, they're not law enforcement officers. We do other stuff. So I think that's healthy.
I think it's healthy for you, and I think it's healthy for your family too. I think it's healthy for you to give them the break from law enforcement, because in essence, they followed your career for 30 years also, so they need that opportunity to retire.
Yeah, I've always been kind of a weird guy. I've never been one of those who come home and talk about. I mean, unless it was something funny, because there's a lot of humor in law enforcement, right?
No,
because you're dealing with human behavior. So
it's
you're
all
like,
it's 24 hours a day of seriousness.
Yeah, so I usually would come home and tell the funny stories, but I have been involved in different situations, life-threatening situations and everything else that your family does go through. You know what I mean? When you have to make that phone call, yeah, okay, I'm okay. I was involved in a shooting, this, that, and the other. Your family does. They go through that, or even getting shot. That's something. But honestly, I think when you walk away from law enforcement, I think it's most important to remember more of the humor. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And I think that's what keeps us going, right? It's a lot of you got to scratch your head. You got to walk forward. You got to move on. It's like, oh, unbelievable, Darwin, right? So, I mean, and that's kind of what I remember. I remember a lot of the funny stories more than the serious stories, And over time, maybe that'll fade too. Like I said, law enforcement's been great for me. I'm grateful, but I'm moving on to the next chapter of my life. This Performa thing, I didn't plan on it, but I feel like I have an obligation to law enforcement, and it's not a lot of time, so I'll give it. And then I'll be moving on, Maui or whatever, my horrid golf game, I tell people, oh, you golf? I said, well, not really. I said,
I have golf clubs and I go to a golf course.
Oh, I tell people, I said, my golf game's like a military maneuver. I outflank every hole. But you know what it is? I'm outside. It's a beautiful day. We live in Southern California. I'm there with people that I'm friends with, so we chew the fat and we make fun of each other hitting the ball. And next thing you know, after 4 hours, you've had a great day and it's time to go home, take a nap.
Well, sir, I thank you for your time. I wish you the best in your future retirement.
Yeah.
Because it definitely sounds like that's what your plan is. But I wish you the best and thank you for your time.
I thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
I appreciate you watching. But before you go, if you like the video, please hit that subscribe button. Also, any comments are appreciated. Thank you.